So now we're looking at the correlational method, which is the third method that we're looking at as far as, or actually the fourth descriptive method that we're going to look at. Now it's a little bit more complicated, but if you look at the word relation in correlational method, you'll see this a very simple definition. When we're looking at a correlation, we're looking at what is the relationship between two things. So I want you to think about this. If it is overcast and dark outside, we think it's probably going to rain. So there's a relationship to the clouds and to the rain. If we speed and pass a cop, we are pretty sure we're going to get a ticket, and so speeding is related to tickets. So we're looking at the relationship between two things. If I go to the store hungry, I'm probably going to buy more food than what I normally would. There's a relationship between hunger and purchasing food. So when we're looking at this, we're not looking at this makes this happen, but we're looking at the fact that it's relative. There's a relationship between the two, whether it's a strong relationship, a weak, or a moderate relationship. So when we're looking at some other items that can be relative to one another, the amount of hours you study does affect your grade. So there is a relationship between hours of study and grade. There's also a relationship between the number of hours of sleep that I get and my mood. I guarantee you there is a relationship between those. There's also been a relationship between smoking and cancer. Not everybody who smokes gets cancer. There's also a relationship between pet ownership and the happiness of those owners. And we could also do one on pet ownership and aggravation, because my dog is eating more than her fair pair of shoes, so there could be some frustration involved as well. So we're looking at variables and how related are they. So with the correlational coefficient, that's actually a number that describes a relationship. So I want you to think about a number and a number that tells a story. So the number 100. Now if I say dollars, that's a wonderful thing. It's a fabulous thing, $100. But what if I say 100 degrees? Then we're like, holy hell, we're in Houston, Texas, okay? And so that tells a story. So although it's 100, what it's added to makes a difference. So 100 on a test, what does that mean? I got everything correct. So numbers actually do tell a very good story for us, and so we use them. Now, a correlational coefficient is not just a number, it's a number that has a sign. And so the sign is going to have a specific number or a specific piece of information. So we have a sign and we have a number. So the sign is either going to be a plus or a minus, positive or negative, and we also have a number associated with it. So let's just say that there was a correlational coefficient of a positive, see there's my sign, 0.87, there's my number. Two different things used for two different parts of the story. And remember, we're talking about the variables. Those two variables, like, the dark clouds and rain, hours of study, and grade. And so when we're looking at these, they're definitely part of the story, but one tells the sign and one part is the number. Okay, so let's talk about what the number actually means, that correlational coefficient. Okay, so in a positive 0.87, what we mean is the sign, that plus sign, is going to show the direction of the relationship. Okay, direction. So plus equals direction. Minus means direction. So we're going to come back to that in a minute. And my number shows me strength. So it's like you have to look at these things as two individual pieces. It's not like a positive 0.87, like 87 cents. We're talking about the positive means direction. It does not influence the number. And the number means something all on its own. So it's not like a plus sign that we use in math. It's not really a positive number. It's a positive sign with a number. All right, so we'll make that make sense in just a minute. So again, we have a sign, we have a number. Get used to making those two things separate, or it's going to get confusing. So if we have a positive correlation, we're using the plus sign. What that plus sign tells you is you have two variables like dark clouds and rain. Those are my two variables. And if I have a plus sign in front of that number, what it means is as one goes up, so does the other. The more dark clouds, the more rain. The more your speed, the more tickets you get. The more food you eat, the heavier you get. Okay, and so this means they're both going in the same direction. They're both increasing. So if I have a positive 0.72, that means both variables go in the same direction because of the positive. Nothing about the 72. It's just the positive. So let's say that we were looking at this. Here's what our findings were. A positive 0.72 correlation was found between the number of hours studied and grade. Now in there, we have to identify my two variables first, two variables. And I know that one of the variables is how much I study, and my grade is the second one. So what I'm looking at now is positive. What does positive mean? If we go back and we look up here, positive means they both go in the same direction. And so what I'm going to do now is put an arrow going in the same direction. And so what this means is, and also remember, same direction also means both go down. So what this means is if I see a positive 0.72 between the number of hours study and grades, I interpret this as meaning one of two things. The more hours one studies, the higher the grade. Okay, that's 2 arrows going up. More study, more grades, higher grades. But also the less I study, the lower the grades. They're the same thing because by definition, remember, both variables go in the same direction because of this positive sign right here. All right, we haven't even touched the 72 yet. We're not there yet. We're still looking at just what the sign means. All right, so now let's look at a negative correlation. That was a positive correlation. What we mean is they go in opposite directions. They go in opposite. Before, they go in the same. That's positive relationship. Negative correlation is they go in opposite directions. So now when you see a plus sign in front of the number, it means one variable goes up, but the other one goes down. So let's look and see what that might look like. So here we have a negative 0.68 correlation was found between alcohol consumption and memory. First thing I'm going to do is identify my variables. What are my two variables? What are they? Alcohol and memory. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the direction. And how do I determine the direction? There's a negative sign. What does negative mean? One goes up, one goes down. So I'm going to put an up arrow next to one, a down arrow next to the other. So now what this means is the more alcohol, again, I'm reading about alcohol, the more alcohol I drink, the less I remember. And Lord, you know, I've never experienced this, ha ha ha. All right, so when we're looking at a negative sign, all this means one goes up, one goes down. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the number. Okay, we've talked about the sign. A plus sign means they both go in the same direction. Negative sign means they go in opposite direction. Now we're going to talk about what the number means. Excuse me. And the number means without the sign, do not look at the sign. The number is going to tell you if it's closer to 1, it's weak, or closer to 0, it's weaker. If it's closer to 1, it's stronger. And so we look at it as kind of like a bar from 0 to 1. And if you look at that 0 being at one end and 1 being at the other, if I have a 0.85, remember this positive sign doesn't mean anything right now because we're talking about strength. And the strength is only about the actual number, no sign. The sign means direction. So all we're looking at is this 0.85. So a 0.85 correlation was found between the number of hours studied and grades. So again, we still have our two variables, hours studied, grades. Well, how strong, how often are these true? Well, 0.85% of the time, kind of. And so when we're looking at this 0.85, what we're saying is that's a strong relationship. So in other words, quite often, if I study more, my grades tend to be higher. Okay, so quite often the sign says they both go up, the number says strength. All right, so continuing. So the number by itself, it is the strength. Only look at the 0.85. So let's look at boundaries. So this is what it's actually going to look like. You can have zero correlation, which means there is no correlation at all. The two never happen together. They never happen together, okay? And a 0.5 means moderate. So, you know, about half of the time they appear together, about. And it doesn't really mean 50%, but you can translate it to that if you would like. And then if it's 1, it means every single time there is variable A, variable B will happen. So what we're talking about here is if it was a 1, my correlation was a positive 1 between rain clouds and rain, that means every single time I saw a dark cloud, it rained every single time. Important to note, very, very rarely is there ever a 0 or a 1. Because rarely is there absolutely no, not even 0.01% of the time. Very rarely do we have that where no relationship exists. And extraordinarily rarely do we have every single time also, okay? So we're going to fall in between these. I can't go below 0. I can't go above 1. All right, so when we're looking at this, again, repeating this, so let's say that a 0.85 was found between number of hours and grade study. That's strong because it's close to 1. But if I look at a negative 0.45 was found between alcohol consumption and memory, again, we got negative, and so that means 1 goes up, 1 goes down, but the strength is only a 0.45. All right, and so that means it's moderate. You know, it's not exactly 0.50, but it's pretty close. So it's going to be moderate. And then a 0.25, positive 0.25, they go together. Okay, but it's a low correlation. So we're not talking about a very, very strong correlation if it's 0.25. All right, so hopefully this makes sense. So the number is direction, or the sign is direction, and the number is the strength. So let's go ahead and look at this quickly. So when we're looking at just the sign, the direction is what the sign stands for. If it is a negative correlation, 1 goes up, 1 goes down. If it's a positive correlation, they either both go down or they both go up. Either one, because they're going in the same direction. Opposite direction, same direction. Okay, so that's just the sign. But now looking at the number, it's just the strength without it's the number without the sign, and then there are my boundaries. All right, great. So that's correlation. Now we're going to go into experiment. So back up. Remember, we did naturalistic observation, we did case study, we did survey, we did correlation. We cannot say cause and effect. Now we're moving into experimentation, which does show cause and effect. So let's go ahead and look at the experiment. So some terms we want to make sure that we understand before we even begin this is, first of all, the experimental group. We have to have 2 groups. One of them is called experimental group, and that experimental group gets a treatment. So whatever you're testing, make note, be careful here. Whatever you're testing, that goes to the experimental group. If you're testing new medication, it goes to the experimental group. If you're testing, you know, how much coffee makes you awake, that coffee goes to experimental group. If we're testing, I don't know, a specific therapy, you know, to reduce anxiety, that specific therapy, if we're trying to see if it's effective, that therapy goes to that experimental group. So whatever you're testing goes there. The control group is going to receive something that looks like the same thing as the experimental group, but it's not. So let's say, for instance, I am testing coffee. I'm saying the effects of coffee and memory. I'm saying that coffee makes your memory better. So or caffeine makes your memory better. So my experimental group is going to get the caffeine, the coffee, the regular coffee. Why? Because that's what I'm saying and makes your memory better. What's the control group going to get? Decaf. So we want to make it to where the 2 groups really don't know that there's any difference. Only you, the experimenter, knows that there's a difference. When we talk about the independent variable or the IV, it's the treatment. It's whatever you're testing. So in other words, the experimental group gets the independent variable. So in this coffee scenario, the caffeine or the regular coffee is going to be the independent variable, the treatment. So one of the ways that I remember this to keep me from getting confused is if you go to the hospital, they put an IV in you. What's in there? It's a treatment. It's a treatment. So the IV is the treatment, and the experimental group gets the treatment. Control group gets something fake. My dependent variable is going to be what we measure to see if that treatment really worked. So if my statement is coffee or caffeine makes memory better, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to give somebody a memory test. So I'm going to give those experimental group people who have drank all this caffeine, I'm going to give them a memory test and I'm going to score them. Then my control group that received the decaf, okay, the fake, the placebo, they got the decaf, and then give them that same memory test. And there should be a difference if I'm correct that caffeine does increase memory. All right, so when we're looking at this, let's go ahead and see how we might break this down. Let's pretend that I have heard this myth that chocolate actually makes your mood better. I know that it does. Absolutely does in my life, okay, but I can't say that it does everywhere else. And so what we're looking at is I'm going to test it. So I need to have two groups. Again, we have the experimental group and we have the control group. So now we have to figure out who gets what. Who gets what? And so for my experimental group, because my question is, does chocolate really improve mood? They're going to get chocolate because whatever it is that I'm testing, they're going to get. So I'm giving them chocolate. Chocolate is the independent variable. Okay, so the experimental group gets what I'm testing. I'm testing chocolate. So control group, maybe I'll give them vanilla. They don't know whether I'm testing. We don't tell people what we're really testing for. So I'm giving them vanilla. Okay, and so, or it could be a chocolate or a brown candy that looks like chocolate. One of my students in class said a fake chocolate. Okay, let's say a fake chocolate. Okay, but I have to give both groups something. And then the question, why do I need two groups? Because I have to compare these two guys. There should be a difference. If I'm correct that chocolate really does improve mood, there should be a difference between those that ate chocolate and those that didn't. There really should be a difference. All right. So when we're looking at experimental group and control group, and I'm done and I've calculated moods, I've tested the moods of everybody, and I have all my data in front of me. Now I want to go ahead and make sure that my statement is true or it's false. So I'm going to compare the mood of this group to the mood of that group. So what am I counting? What is it that I'm using to assess? The mood. And so when I'm looking at this, if my hypothesis is true, I should see people that are happier in the experimental group if I'm true, if I'm right in my assessment. What I'm measuring is the mood. Okay, so maybe before the study happened, I asked a series of questions that indicated your mood before the study started. Then I do your testing again on your mood, and I see has your mood increased or decreased. So what am I measuring is the mood. That's the dependent variable. So experimental group gets the treatment. Control group gets something that you're not testing for. Mood improvement should be better here. And the independent variable is going to be chocolate. Dependent variable is going to be the actual mood. All right, so what I'm going to do is make sure that I understand that I have to have two groups. Experimental group gets the IV, which is the treatment. Control group gets a placebo or some other form of treatment. The independent variable goes here to this group. And then the dependent variable is going to be what I measure comparing these two groups. All right, so that is experiment, that is correlation. So there you go. And we have completed everything that we're going to talk about as far as the research methods go.